Hi, Dr. Atchison here, and we're still on Chapter 7. This is the fifth lecture of the Chapter 7, and we are finishing up Piaget's cognitive development theory on with his stage of formal operations. So as a recap, we've gone through sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and finally we're in formal operational. This doesn't start till about 12 years of age, and it typically runs through adulthood.
The formal operational stage of cognitive development is reached when an adolescent begins to think abstractly and to reason hypothetically. When asked the hypothetical question, what if people had no thumbs, pre-adolescent children like Jalur and Jenny respond much differently than adolescents do.
Because I have 4 fingers. I wouldn't be able to write or nothing.
You wouldn't be able to tell a person that they're, good and this.
That's good.
And you wouldn't be able to write really good. And you couldn't play thumb wrestling.
Adolescents are able to mentally picture this hypothetical situation, contrast it with reality, and produce a variety of conclusions regarding the implications of being without thumbs.
Man, I think the whole world would change, kind of. I know a friend of mine who's a lefty, and in 5th grade we were just shooting the breeze one day, and she said, the whole world's made for righties. I said, what are you talking about, the whole world's made for righties? She said, well, door handles all open a certain way, tables are made a certain way, desks in school are all made for righties. You'll notice that when you get in, you can prop your right arm up but not your left one. And sort of for the next week or so, I kept my eye out, and she was right. I mean, the whole world is sort of tailored to the majority, the righties. And so I think if we were to lose something as simple but critical as our thumb, the whole world would change. Maybe a bunch of little things, but all those little things would add up to something major, and I think the whole world would be different.
So, as you could hear, that major component of formal operational thought is this process of kind of making hypotheses and deciding if these are correct or not. And this reasoning, this hypothetical deductive reasoning, is what Piaget says is that major milestone that you reach in formal operations. Remember, operations is how we process all these things mentally, as opposed to in the earlier stages, such as sensory motor, where we were talking about actions. Operation is about kind of thinking. And so, again, what Piaget is saying here is that this is kind of the top of thinking, that we're able to kind of evaluate possibilities and probable outcomes. One of the examples of the task that he would use to do was the pendulum task. And he would give a individual a pendulum, and sometimes it would be just one, sometimes it would be a series of one, and kind of ask, what makes the pendulum swing, and how does it swing faster, and how does it swing slower, and what's the difference that makes these differences between how the pendulum swings? Is it the weight on the bottom of it? Is it the length of the string? And knowing the answer wasn't important. What was important was being able to think through the possibilities and come up with a hypothesis and test that hypothesis. In hypodeductive reasoning, again, they're taking a hypothesis, and they're taking this from a general theory. So it begins with a possibility. So, maybe it's that the size of the weight that affects the pendulum, and testing that to see if that's a reality. Maybe it's the size of the string that matters, and testing that to see if it's a reality. So an example of this is propositional thought. And this is evaluating the logic of verbal propositions. So if any of you have ever taken a logic class, that's basically what the entire class is about, is kind of these propositional thoughts. And so here's an example. So either the poker chip in my hand is green or it is not green. And the other statement is the poker chip in my hand is green and it is not green. And the idea is, how do you work through these and figure out which one of these things is true? Are either of these things true, or are they false? So either the poker chip in my hand is green or it is not green. If there are solid poker chips, it's either green or it's not, right? It can't be some sort of combination. The poker chip in my hand is green and it is not green. Again, if there's solid poker chips, we can't have that. Now, in the case of these poker chips, where they're green and white, or red and white, and blue and white, both of these statements could be true. Either the poker chip in my hand is green or it is not green. It can be both green and not green. And the poker chip in my hand is green and it is not green. So again, you could evaluating these things. What we see is in middle childhood, they really rely on the visual chip. They have to kind of compare it to the chip to be able to reason through this, is what Piaget said. Where in adolescence, they can analyze the logic of these statements. So according to Piaget, someone who's younger, like 12 or below, isn't going to be able to do a logic class, isn't going to be able to do these kinds of logic statements and evaluate their truthfulness or not, because again, of where they are in, according to Piaget, cognitive development. Now, just like we've talked about in every other stage of Piaget's theory, not everything Piaget said was right. We know that school-age children actually start developing these abstract thinking skills a lot earlier. In fact, they start trying to push some of this critical thinking and these having a hypothesis and testing it really, really young. I volunteered a lot in my daughter's STEM lab last year when she was a kindergartner. And they were pushing a hypothesis and testing your hypothesis. How would you see if your hypothesis is true? So they're pushing these critical thinking skills a lot earlier, with the idea that then they can kind of think through them earlier. We know that there's problems with propositional thinking. We know that logic's really a necessity for this to kind of work. And again, we see that school-age children are doing these things a lot earlier than Piaget said, which is, again, the major criticism to Piaget's theory, is that he really was kind of off on the timescales, that a lot of these things were early. However, formal operation is a little bit different than the other three. It also has that some of these things will be happening early, but it also has that formal operations may not be universal. We see that training and context really contribute to the ability to do Piaget's tasks, to kind of engage in propositional thought. And we also know that once you reach formal operations, that doesn't mean that every decision you make is done through this formal operational hypodeductive reasoning pattern. I know when I'm living my life, not everything is a logic problem. And I loved logic. I took logic in college and blew it out of the water because I loved it. And so I am a very logical and I am a very analytical thinking. And even I often fall back on the easier thinking and just kind of go with your gut or go with, what seems easy and not necessarily having to go through all these steps. I really enjoy going through that, and I do it frequently. Half the reason I teach is so that I can kind of think through these problems, because I really enjoy that. I enjoy that hypodeductive reasoning. But do I do it 100% of the time? No. And again, that's one of the major criticisms to Piaget, is that you don't hit this stage of thinking and that that's the only way you think from now on. No. We also know another major criticism is that schooling really is an essential factor in this. Again, we're seeing it a lot earlier because schools are pushing it a lot earlier. We see that some cultures don't develop it because these cultures don't teach it. A culture that doesn't have an organized educational system is not going to develop hypodeductive reasoning because they're not being taught to think that way. So again, that we know that schooling really is an essential factor to Piaget's theory. And again, younger children are more advanced than Piaget thought. All these tasks are unfamiliar and require a lot of verbal competence. And to some extent, not only competence, but confidence, especially in these hypodeductive reasoning. To not only be able to think through the problem, but verbally express yourself and do so when an adult, a researcher, is asking you. So again, we see that a lot of children have more advanced skills than Piaget thought, including adolescents. But it really, some of this verbal competence and confidence really plays a role. And we see some ability to do perspective taking and understand these other tasks much, much earlier. In adolescence, we see that there actually is a lower level of performance than Piaget proposed. And again, that's what I was just talking about. We don't always do formal operational thoughts 100% of the time. He really had this idea of children as scientists. And so that once they got to kind of his level of, hypodeductive reasoning, that's where you just stayed all the time. And we know that that's not the case. And clearly, if you've been on social media at any point, you see that not everybody is doing hypodeductive reasoning all the time. Otherwise, most of the stuff that's on the internet wouldn't be there. So again, we see actually a lower level of performance than Piaget had proposed. And we know that training or a prompt can really promote the use of this formal operational thought. If you're being told to think kind of hypothetically, that can be a prompt that tells you, hey, I'm supposed to think through this problem. If you're just told a question, you may think that there's just one answer, and you go to that. And so again, there's a difference depending on kind of how the question's asked, how training, how education plays a role. And again, there's that cultural implications of it as well. What the culture says is important really will dictate where individuals get in formal operations, if they get to it at all. So again, in a culture that doesn't have a formal educational system, we aren't going to see that level of hypodeductive reasoning because that's not important for that culture. Whereas in our culture, tries to push education, in an educational setting, hypodeductive reasoning is important. And we still in college try and press that. In the psychology department, we have critical thinking through writing courses because that is an important component, according to our culture, of education. But again, that's different depending on different cultures and depending on different environments. So that wraps up our conversation on Piaget, and it wraps up our conversation on formal operations. Thanks.